So this is an idea that I've been interested in for a little while, and I think it could be quite helpful, so I'm going to try and explain it to you. The question is, how do historians see the past and how do they see each other? So I'm using a visual metaphor here because, of course, historians can't see the past because the past is invisible because it's gone. They can't see each other. Well, sometimes they can see each other if they rock up to the same conference, or if they work in the same building, they see each other. But that's not really what I mean. When they read each other's books, they sort of see each other's ideas because they are, unless they're blind, seeing the words on the page, but they're also seeing each other's ideas. Now, this idea has been explored by a few people, but it's never been explained the way I would like it to see explained. But here's an idea for you. This comes from a dude called John Lewis Gaddis, who we're going to study in a week or so's time. And he recently published this book, and he uses another visual metaphor for history, but he uses the map and the landscape as his metaphor. And I'll try and explain what I think he means. So he talks about seeing like a historian, as if historians have a particular way of seeing things in the way a painter or a photographer might see things. And he makes the distinction between history with a small h, the past, and history with a big H. And he says we historians can only represent, we can only portray when we do history with a big H, because we can never go back to history with a small h to check for ourselves, because there's no such thing as a time-travelling machine. And he says we can never go back to see for sure. So he's making a distinction between seeing it with your own eyes, for sure, after travelling in a time machine, and portraying it, representing it when you write about it in the present. He returns to this idea and says we represent it, but studying more history gives us a wider view. So we're back to that idea of vision, sight, seeing the past, even though we can't actually see it. So let's go back to that historian with his lens, his microscope. When he studies the past, these are the sorts of words I think you should try to use. So he sees the past, he regards it, he views it, but he also explores and perceives it, which are kind of visual metaphors as well. When he looks at the past, he discerns patterns, he examines with his metaphorical lens there. Scrutinizing, surveying, envisaging, these are all things that all words that we might use to describe what historians do when they study the past. When they write about the past, we use similar terms. So we talk about historians revealing things about the past, demonstrating, illuminating, shedding light on. Or if they're telling us a story, we might say they paint a picture of the Yalta Conference, or they provide an image of Stalin's paranoia. They show us things, they provide us with insights, they uncover new details, or they highlight particular things. These are all visual terms that we would quite happily use when we're writing about history. So these are the sorts of words that I want you to get comfortable using. Now, let's just imagine an evil historian. You wouldn't believe how long it took me to create this evil historian, by the way. But let's imagine this evil historian who we really don't like. We really disapprove of the way he writes about the past. And so we've got some pretty serious criticisms. What would we say when we're criticizing this terrible historian? We'd say that he distorts or manipulates or misrepresents or exaggerates. Again, we're using these visual terms to make a distinction between good history and bad history. And so I want you to try to think about how we write about historians and their ideas, because in a short time, that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to be writing about these historians. And I want to try to develop this idea a little bit further by showing you how these historians interact with each other. Historians live in a strange world where they spend lots of their time researching in archives. They spend lots of their time teaching in universities, and they spend lots of their time reading and writing books. And they are often quite polite to each other, but not always. So here is an article. It's a printout because I don't have the original copy, but it comes from the New York Review of Books, and this is published in October 1979. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. And it's a series of books. So these are the books, and they've all been sent to one guy to write a review. And our guy is Arthur Schlesinger, who you know about. And Arthur Schlesinger writes this quite long, quite thoughtful review of these books. And in this book review, he writes some quite unkind things about these revisionist historians. As we know, Arthur Schlesinger wasn't a revisionist, and he didn't think much of the revisionists. But he writes quite a detailed review of their books. And in the process, he says some relatively mean things in quite a polite way. Moving on, a month or two later, somebody else, another historian, a dude called Stephen J. Cagney, writes into the New York Review of Books, and he says, some comment seems to be in order on a number of the things that Arthur Schlesinger says in his review, and he begins to engage with the reviews, and he says, in my judgment, what Schlesinger says is not really a fair assessment, and it's particularly unfair for what he says about William Appleman Williams. He says, I can understand why Schlesinger doesn't like William Appleman Williams, but I don't think what he says about him is very fair. And he goes on to lay out what he thinks William Appleman Williams's main points are, and he points out what Arthur Schlesinger has failed to understand. And he says, I don't know how Schlesinger's going to respond, but I think it's important that these ideas are addressed. He says, I'm no special fan of Williams or the revisionists. I don't think that they have written the perfect history of the Cold War, but I do think it's important to give a fair review of all of this stuff. And the editors of the New York Review of Books obviously thought that they were onto something good, because they passed it on to Arthur Schlesinger and asked him to respond. And Mr. Schlesinger, Professor Schlesinger, responds and explains why he was right in the first place and why William Appleman Williams is a bit of an idiot. And there ends this episode. Shortly afterwards, William Appleman Williams gets involved in the same publication a couple of months later, and he says, as the ball being batted around, permit me a few words. And he goes off to explain about golf, and he says that it's a useful idiom. He says there are two ways you can win at golf. One is to play the people, and the other is to play the course. And he says, of these two suggestions, I think playing the course is the better one. And in this case, he thinks that Cagney has the better of it because he's talking about the course, or the history, rather than the leaderboard. So he's implying there that Schlesinger is playing the leaderboard, playing the man, rather than playing the course. And he says, there's something interesting. It's something interesting if you really care. And he goes on to explain what he thinks about a particular piece of evidence. And he gives 4 reasons why he thinks it's important. And then he says, but play the course yourself. In other words, make up your own mind. New York Review of Books are obviously enjoying this, so they pass this on to Arthur Schlesinger. And Schlesinger replies, Williams would be less than generous if he did not support Mr. Cagney. And Mr. Cagney, by the way, who's provided in his letter a more measured and thoughtful statement of the Williams case than Williams has ever made for himself. In other words, William Appleman Williams can't explain his own ideas properly, but he lets his own ally down. And then he goes on to explain why he was right all along for the third time, and finishes by saying he's abandoned that game evidently for golf. I don't care about golf. I'm a tennis player myself. But interestingly here, he makes reference to William Appleman Williams's point about the evidence and says he can't even get his evidence right because he misquotes the evidence. And then there's a footnote which says this misquotation, though in this case venial rather than mortal, in other words, not that important, is typical of the general sloppiness of Williams's scholarship, and then quotes the document in full. So what have we got here? We've got a couple of historians in particular being very mean to each other in polite language in public because they see the Cold War differently and they hate each other as a consequence.